So, why exactly do you need a home inspection and an appraisal done on the house that you're buying? Don't they basically do the same exact thing? Well, in this episode, we'll be answering that question coming up. Thank you so much for joining us today on the PRCPG Podcast. My name is Eric Coleman, and if this is your first time here, welcome. We're so glad to have you. If you haven't already had a chance to take a listen to our introductory episode, I highly encourage you to go ahead and go do that. Maybe wait until after this episode, just so you have a better idea. But please take a minute, go listen to that episode. That way you have a full understanding of who we are, what we're about, why we created this podcast, and our vision for giving people value in what we do here. Also, if after you've listened to today's episode, if you have received value, if you find value in the information that you have gained today, then we would love it if you would consider leaving us a review. We certainly pay attention to every single one, and we want to make sure that we are getting better each and every time. And so we thank you in advance for considering doing that for us.
Thank you.
All right. So, and again, we always love to hear your thoughts. And so, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the episode here. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to explain what both of these are. Okay. So, first of all, what is an inspection? Well, we commonly refer to an inspection as a whole home inspection. All right. So, you'll hear people say, I want a home inspection. I need to get an inspection. Well, in the industry, we call it a whole home inspection, and that's what the inspectors will call it as well. And the reason for that is because they basically are looking at the home from the ground up, and even sometimes underneath the ground. If it's got a pier and beam foundation, they'll crawl into the crawl space, and they will check out every nook and cranny of this house before before you move on with your purchase.
Hey, I think we got something.
So it's important to understand exactly what that is. And the reason is because you need to know what they're there to do for you. All right. So they are there to basically find those really large problems. So anything from foundation to roof, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, wood destroying insects. And we'll get into that in a minute. But they're there to notify you of anything like that. But also on those reports, okay, those reports will have things that are small, like the electrical outlet plate is missing a screw, right? So that's something to consider. Now, keep in mind, an inspector is someone who went through very specific training with the state of Texas, and they have met all the standards that they need. They also have an apprenticeship program that they go through to make sure that they are able to accurately identify when something is what they consider deficient or not. Okay, and clearly, just like anything else, when people have been doing this for a while, they start actually noticing things that, maybe some others wouldn't notice. But more importantly, they'll notice things and say, look, this looks bad, but it's really not. So I don't want to ruffle your feathers about it, right? And so you can move forward buying this property with peace of mind, knowing that it's really just an eyesore or a cosmetic thing or something like that. So that's what they do for you. They are there to make sure they find everything that they consider to be deficient. They try to stay up to date on codes. If there's anything out of code in your house, they'll make sure that is noted as well on the inspection report that you receive. Okay. Now, when do they do it? Well, they typically do it during the option period. And I've talked about the option period before on previous episodes, but that option period is usually anywhere between 3 and 10 days after going under contract on the purchase of your new home. The reason that we do this during the option period is because we want to give you the best opportunity to change your mind, basically. If there's something that maybe the seller, maybe you see something on the report that you're like, I'm not okay with this, and you ask the seller to do something about it. Well, if the seller is refusing to do something, or not necessarily refusing, but kind of dragging their feet on it and getting closer and closer to that option end date, then a lot of times our clients will go ahead and just say, hey, you know what, Eric, I want to go ahead and terminate the contract under option. Maybe we can come back to it later, but right now I'm just not willing to take the risk. Okay, fair enough. But that's why we do that, because the bargaining power, the negotiating power is still in your hands fully during that option period. So again, that's when most of those repair negotiations and things like that will take place. So a whole home inspection will typically run you about, I usually say anywhere between like $400 and $600. It really depends on square footage, typical size of the home. You know, for a typical residential home, like a single family residential home, I'd say that's pretty accurate. It can definitely go up in price, though, if your home is larger than what would be considered average. So just keep that in mind. They do typically charge based on square footage. Also, your price can go up a little bit if there's any add-on services, such as if there's a septic system needs to be inspected, or if there's an irrigation system, if they need to test well water, just little things like that. A big one that most people, well, not most people, but a lot of people do, is what we call the WDI, the Wood Destroying Insect Inspection. Okay, in Texas, that's usually carpenter ants and termites. So you'll typically hear us refer to it as, hey, did you get a termite inspection? Matter of fact, most people do call it a termite inspection. Now, something to note, if you're using a VA loan to purchase your home, a termite inspection or a WDI inspection is mandatory. The VA requires it. All right, so that is something to keep in mind. Price-wise, you're usually looking at about an extra $100 to $150, depending on the inspector. All right, so now who does the home inspector work for? Well, they work for you. They don't work for me, the buyer's agent. They don't work for the listing agent. They don't work for the seller. They certainly don't work for the lender, okay, for your loan or your bank, your lender. They work for you.
I work for you now.
So what that means is they are there to figure things out for you, all right? And if for whatever reason you decide that, you know, you want to share that report with someone else, well, that's completely up to you, but they will not share it with anybody without your express permission, okay? It's proprietary to you. So they are in your corner. They want to make sure you get the best property possible. And so I feel like it's important to point that out, because a lot of times it's easy to think that these people just show up and they don't have your best interest in heart. In this case, they do. So now, how does a home inspection affect a home purchase, and why is it important? Well, it's important because you want to know what you're buying, right? Consider it like the test drive, okay? The only difference is you take your mechanic with you to the dealership, and your mechanic's the one driving the car and popping the hood and looking at everything, right? Instead of you getting in there and saying, yeah, I think I kind of know what I'm talking about, but meh, not really. So if you're like me, I'll be the first to admit that I don't know anywhere near as much about cars as I should. So it's always a gamble, right? For me, I'm always the one that I'm like, well, maybe I should really be looking at a new car, even though that's not necessarily going to save you. But I feel more comfortable doing that than looking at a used vehicle, because I just don't know as much, right? And if I brought my mechanic with me everywhere, if I had the money to just pay someone to follow me around, that would be a non-issue. And in this case, that's what you're doing. You're paying somebody money to come in, test drive the house, make sure that everything is in working condition, and anything that isn't, they tell you about, so that you can either plan to have it fixed, ask the seller to fix it before you close, or walk away because it's just too much. Okay? So as far as how it can affect you, the only way that it can affect you from an out of your control standpoint, all of those things are in your control. The only thing that's out of your control would be if you're using that VA loan and you go to get your wood destroying insect inspection and something came back that needed to be corrected. In that case, you would have to take action on that before the lender would be able to give you money, and that is a VA requirement. Okay. Again, that only affects people that have that VA eligibility.
Years ago, I was in the Army.
Okay, so now let's talk about an appraiser. An appraisal, right? Okay, so what is an appraisal? Well, the textbook definition is an appraisal is an opinion of value, okay? There's many different opinions of value out there on your home, okay? So once you buy the home, right? So you've got the market opinion of value. So basically, how much is a buyer willing to pay for this house? Then you have the tax assessed value. How much is the county or the county appraisal district assessing for that house? In other words, what sort of value do they give it? Now, that typically is less than what you're looking at, but than what you're looking at market or even appraised, okay, like with an appraised value, but sometimes it's not. So it's important to know the difference. And then you have the appraiser, right? The appraiser is someone who has gone through very specific training with the state of Texas and done an apprenticeship for anywhere from a year to a year and a half. I've heard of it taking longer depending on how many hours they're able to do. But they go through this process specifically so that they can help banks not overpay, or in this case, overlend, right? Overextend when it comes to lending money to buyers like you. It keeps the banks out of trouble, but honestly, it helps you as well, because if you've agreed to pay a certain price on a home and the appraiser comes in and says, based on comps, based on features, benefits, everything about this house and everything that has recently sold and what the market is doing right now, no, this house is not worth that much. Well, it's a little bit of a disappointment, and it can result in the termination of a contract, but really it's there to protect you, because who wants to go ahead and overpay for a house, right? You don't want to get into a home, take out a loan, and realize that if you had to sell it 6 months down the road, that you're not even going to come close to getting what you paid for it and breaking even, right? So they're there to protect the bank, okay? So that kind of rolls me into, who they work for. They work for the bank, all right? They don't work for you. They don't work for me. They don't work for anyone other than the bank. And no one that's involved in the transaction is even allowed to have contact with them. Typically, even the bank has an appraisal desk that contacts an appraisal management company. And it's a very closely watched thing, because if any of those lines are crossed, then in some cases, the appraisal can be thrown out and you have to go through the process all over again. It's that big of a deal. Now, when do they do an appraisal? Well, typically they will come out and they will do an appraisal it depends, really. It depends on when the appraisal is ordered. It depends on the type of loan. So let's talk about that real quick. So if it's a VA loan, typically that's the one that you can kind of count on the most, because once it has been assigned to an appraiser, the appraiser has 14 days to get the appraisal back to the appraisal management company or the bank, whoever it is that they're turning it into. Okay, and that's really nice. If you're using a conventional or an FHA loan, you're kind of subject to the appraiser and their schedule. So this can be 14 days, it can be 10 days, it can be 21 days. I've actually had appraisers and schedule us out for 6 weeks. So sometimes it can be a lengthy process, depending on the loan, depending on the appraiser's schedule availability, also depending on who the bank uses, right? Not all appraisers work with all banks. So you want to make sure that you have at least a pretty good understanding. Now, it's just not something you can generally control. It's not something your agent can control.
I'm losing my mind.
It can be very frustrating. I'll just put it out there. It can be extremely frustrating. But just so you know what to expect, this is the reason I do these podcasts. I want you to know what to expect when you enter into a real estate transaction and all the different facets, things that can happen. So that's the timeline. There for a while, we were really, really bogged down with appraisals. I think now we're starting to catch up, and so I haven't seen very many take that long. As a matter of fact, I just had a VA one, which, as I stated before, is typically the easier one to have done. But I mean, we had it done in 14 days, just like we thought. So now, who does an appraiser work for? Well, I've kind of already alluded to this. They work for the bank. Okay, they work directly for the bank. They don't work for the seller. They don't work for the buyer. They work for the bank. So, who pays for it? Well, the buyer, you pay for the appraisal. Now, typically that's done in one of two ways. Either the lender will charge you up front for the appraisal. Sometimes they'll refund that money if things go sideways. Sometimes they won't. Or some lenders will go ahead and just pay for the appraisal, and then they will collect that at closing as part of your closing costs. So really, that's kind of how that works. Now, how does it affect a home purchase? All right, well, here's where it gets interesting. I kind of already talked about this a little bit, right, as far as the benefits for you, but the way it really affects a home purchase is, let's say you offer $300,000 for a house. Let's say the house is listed at $300,000 and you offer $300,000.
Sold.
Great. Whatever the contract price is, that's what the bank is going to tell the appraiser that, hey, look, this is what the contract price is. Go out and tell us, what the actual appraised value of this home is, so we make sure we're not wasting money, basically. We're not giving more money than we should for the purchase of this house. So they'll go out, and let's say that it comes in at $290,000 instead of $300,000. Okay, well, now this is where it can affect the purchase of the home. And I'll back up for just a second. If it comes in at $300,000 or more, you're golden. Everybody's golden, and the deal moves forward because the house is at least worth $300,000 or more. But if it comes into that $290,000, I usually tell all my clients, you've got 4 options. Okay, you can the seller can either reduce the price of the home down, $10,000 down to $290,000, and y'all can agree to move forward. You can meet the seller halfway somehow, either a straight 50-50 split or, something else. It's all negotiable. You, the buyer, can just agree to bring the extra $10,000 to closing as additional down payment money. Or no one agrees. Nobody wants to move. Nobody wants to do anything. And if you can't agree, then the contract just terminates. And typically, especially for VA and FHA loans, there's a document that's written into those loans called an amendatory clause. Typically, that's with FHA. FHA amendatory clause, but the same applies for VA as well. Even if you're outside of your financing contingency window, which I know I'm getting in the weeds a little bit here.
I'm sorry, is this too in the weeds?
We can talk about that a little bit more in a later episode. But if you're outside of that, you're still covered under that amendatory clause. Everybody signs it. And if the appraisal comes in low, then as the buyer, you don't even have to negotiate with the seller. You can just walk right then if you want to. Most people will try to negotiate. But if you can't come to terms, then you can terminate the contract based on the fact that the home didn't appraise at the contract price. You can get your earnest money back and walk away and find another house. So, it does have an impact. It has a really big impact on what it is that you do. Now, I kind of already touched on this a little bit, but if the contract terminated, would you get your money back for either one of these? What I will say is, let's say you're using a conventional loan and it doesn't appraise, but nobody agrees. Okay, you can't come up with the money. They're not going to come down. Whatever the case is. In order for the contract to terminate, and it can terminate, and everybody can walk away, but in order for it to terminate and you get your earnest money back, you have to be within that financing contingency window. There's really no other way around it because there's no other provision in there for that. So something I can get into on a later episode, but it's important to make sure that your agent has written in enough time into the third-party financing addendum to make sure that you are covered if and when this becomes an issue. But basically, yes, if it's due to a low appraisal, there are provisions in the contract for you to be able to get your earnest money back if the conditions are met. If it's an inspection issue, or let me back up. If it's not an inspection issue, but you terminate the contract at some point, and it doesn't have anything to do with the inspection, no, you don't get that money back. That money is money you have to be okay with spending up front right after you go under contract because, and I've said this in one of my YouTube videos, it's what I consider to be a mandatory out-of-pocket expense. Now, I know I just said the word mandatory. And you'd be like, but Eric, you said it wasn't, you didn't have to. You're right. You do not have to have a home inspection. But for the majority of people, a home inspection is something they consider mandatory on themselves. Most people do, right? Just that peace of mind is what you're looking for. But you won't get that money back. You are paying for a service. Even the termite inspection that is mandatory for VA, you won't get that money back. You're paying for a service. It has nothing to do with the lender, has nothing to do, it's not in the contract, none of those things. So that money it will be a wash, okay? Folks, that is all I have. I hope that I didn't muddy the waters too much and that you were able to actually get some good nuggets out of this but really understand the difference between a home inspection and a home appraisal when it comes to you being under contract for your new home. Okay. This gets confused a lot, which is why I wanted to make this episode. I've had clients say, wait a minute, didn't we already pay for this? No, it's a separate thing and it has a separate function. And I'll go in that other episode I was talking about, I can go into a little bit more detail on the appraisals themselves, how they kind of get sticky, what they mean to certain loans and things like that. But for the most part, that's the difference. Okay. Yes, they are both necessary. If you are financing the purchase of your home, they are both necessary. If you're paying cash for a house, guess what? You don't need an appraisal. And again, you don't technically have to have a home inspection, but even if you're paying cash for a house, always, always, always get a home inspection. That is what I'm going to tell you that you should do. I'll never tell you have to, but I am going to tell you that you should do it. So that said, that is all we have for today. I really hope that you guys got value out of this. I hope that I was able to maybe clear up a few things for some folks that maybe didn't know the difference. And like I said earlier, our goal is to educate. Our goal is to provide value. Our goal is to make sure that you move forward with your next real estate transaction with a peace of mind and a greater understanding of what's actually going on, so that you're not constantly saying, well, what was that? And what's this? And, having to pick up the phone every 2 seconds. Okay. But listen, if you have thoughts about the episode today or any other episode that you've listened to of ours in the past, we would love to hear about it. So if you've got some time, either, like I said, you can write us a review. We'd love to hear your thoughts, but more so, if you want to continue the conversation, we actually have a private Facebook group. It's the PRCPG Podcast Facebook group. And in there, I have set this all up just for you to have a place to go in and just leave your thoughts and ask questions. If you have additional questions about what you've heard on any of these episodes, please ask them. I want to know, and I do read them, and so I will be happy to respond. In addition, if there's a topic or something that you want us to talk about that we have not addressed yet on this podcast, I want to hear that too, because I always want to make sure that the content that I'm giving is content that's important to you and that it's valuable to you, right? So please let us know. Go over there, check us out. All right, no harm, no foul. With that, I will just leave you. If you've been here before, you know this, but if this is your first time, we do post a new episode every Wednesday. So we hope to see you on the next one. All right, till then, stay safe. Have a blessed week.